For the first section of practice, we're going to start with the black and white part of the portrait, so the upper left-hand corner, and you're going to be using any black and white materials that you would like. In this video, I'm working pretty much mainly with newspaper and then pieces of a book or pages of a book, but you could feel free to use the black and white tissue paper as well, tin foil, so any materials that are black and white you can use for this. I'm going to go ahead and play the video time-lapse so you can see the process of going through this first section. I'd also like you to use only squares for this section, so I'm starting out with a couple of different types of book pages for squares, and I'm cutting them into strips and then into the smaller pieces. And I'm using a couple of different books, and I am just cutting out some of the pages where the value change looks a little bit different. So some of these pages I want to look lighter where the text is spread further apart, and then the second book that I cut, you can see how the text is darker and closer together. So those will be areas that I can use as more medium tones. And then I'm going to use darker pages or pictures out of this book, like this image here, and then maybe some pages from magazines for the shadows or the darker areas. So any picture that has some gray or dark values. So it's important to have highlights, medium tones, and shadows for your sections. Then I'm going to start out and just start collaging this lighter value. So looking at this area, everything is pretty much a highlight or medium tone. So that means I can use some pages with some of the text closer together to get some of those gray tones, and then maybe some white pages or white tissue paper. So really look at the value change in each section. Again, that largest section is mainly a highlight or medium tone. And I'm just kind of brushing some glue down first and sticking these pieces on. Then I'm looking at the hair on the left side that starts to get a little bit darker. So I'm using the light gray and the dark gray pages out of the book to incorporate some of the darker values. And then I'm painting around the eye here where it's a little bit darker than the nose. So I'm putting a few of those medium tone gray values into it and maybe mixing a few of the lighter values from the book pages into this section as well. So I'm just making sure to put glue down every once in a while and trying my best to kind of stick with the main blocks of value. I know that it is tricky working with such small details, but try your best to really cut things out as small as possible. The smaller the pieces, the more detail and value change you're going to be able to show, and the better your end result will be. So try your best to work as small as you can. Right now I'm bringing in those darkest areas around the outside of the eye. I'm not too worried about what it's going to completely look like detail-wise at this point. I'm really just focused on blocking in the main values, because the last step is going to be going back in with either Sharpie or charcoal and adding detail and value on top of what I have. So for now I'm just adding in as much value change as I can. You can even layer things, maybe incorporate a few smaller details or areas of color into it, like the middle of the eye there. So at this point I have everything blocked in, and I'm deciding to go in with some watercolor. And you can use different materials for this, but I'm using watercolor for the example. And I'm using warm tones in my highlight area to make those brighter, and cool tones in my shadow areas to make them darker. So if you want to just kind of follow what I have for practice, you definitely can. But again, I use yellow for some of those lighter values. I'm going to pause this for a second. But looking at the top of this reference picture, you can see how it's slightly darker and then fades into more of a lighter value. So at the top of this, I'm making it a darker yellow value, so less water. And then as I transition down towards the base of the nose, I'm adding a little bit more water to start to lighten that flow of value change. And again, I'm using the blue in the darkest areas and starting to just slowly refine and incorporate more detail. So I'm going to keep playing the time lapse here. So I'm bringing in some of that darker blue, adding a little bit of black to some of the areas of detail just to get some of those tones shaded in. You could even opt to just stick with black and white in the black and white section and maybe only use black watercolor and just still create those transitions of watercolor on top. And then the last step that I do want you to go in with for a technique is adding text on top. So when you're finished, I want you to try to use text to incorporate and emphasize the value change. So I'm going to pause this for a second again. But you can see that there's not many areas where you can necessarily fit text, but I want you to try in the main area of the nose to show that value change coming down. So this reference picture is a picture of my sister, so I just used her name here and repeated it throughout the face just to incorporate some of that text, but you can write whatever you would like. And I'm just repeating it over and over again, closer together where it's darker, and then making the text larger and spread more apart where it's lighter. And then some of these areas of smaller detail, I'm writing the name really tiny to emphasize where some of those darker spots are for the eyelashes and the edge of the eye. And then I'm also just using the pen here, and I want you guys to do this, to go in with either the thin Sharpie, a pen, and really go over the smallest detail possible. So I'm just refining the outline of the eye, refining some texture on the eyebrow, and again, bringing in more text into those lighter areas. So I want you to try each of these techniques just to give yourself a lot that you can choose from for your final project. This last step that I'm doing is the white charcoal. The white charcoal works great going on top of these materials to really lighten the highlights. So that last part, you're going to take the white charcoal, just go over some of the highlights in maybe the eye that got a little bit dull or dark, and then the base of the nose to lighten that as well. But when you're finished, you'll move on to the next section. Again, try your best to be as detailed as possible. It's going to really help you to kind of refine your style and figure out, again, which way you want to take things for your final one, and just work out all the kinks now. I know it is something tricky with hand-eye coordination, but again, try your best to get those small shapes and a lot of detail.